What is up, my beautiful gemstones? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, just welcome. My name is GemmaJade, but today we are going to be listening to a reading from my third book, Shadow Entities, Sleep Paralysis, and Beyond. I feel like the title of this book has a lot of people thinking that it's about sleep paralysis. And I feel like they don't realize it's one of the only books, out there about the shadow entity, shadow person phenomenon. And I just thought that if I gave you guys a couple of chapters, maybe you'll be more interested in it. If you haven't purchased it yet, then you'll do so. If you want autographed copies, you can email me, GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. All of that info will be in the description box, and I'll go over it at the end. Also, links, Kindle, paperback, Audible, to every single one of my books in the description box. Now, I'm going to read the introduction and one or two chapters, so let's just jump right in. Introduction to Shadow Entities, Sleep Paralysis, and Beyond. In my field of work, I come across a lot of strange and bizarre information, and normally I am all too pleased to share it with the public who take the time to watch my channel and read my books. A lot of it is anecdotal, and I use it to start conversations in the streams when I feel there might be a lull. This, however, is not one of those topics. Though I am sure you'll find it quite interesting, it's a bit terrifying to most people to just randomly insert into a conversation. The fact that it is 1,000,000% true is also something most people will have a hard time wrapping their heads around. I am here now to inform you all of what is happening all around us and to call your attention to it, as I know most of us, even in this community, aren't even aware of all of it. That's what makes this even scarier to me. The fact that, with all of the abilities floating around throughout this community and just in general, most human beings have no idea that any of this is happening. Okay, so in truth, a lot of us may have a clue, but do we really know the extent as to which we are another, or several others for that matter, creatures' food? I mean, no wonder there's such rampant sickness and lethargy, depression, and even addiction in the world. This is by no means or in any way, shape, or form saying that mental illness doesn't exist and that it's always the case that some creature is feeding off of the person's energy and spirit, but I will say this. I am fairly certain, and in fact mostly sure, that this is the cause of most of our human suffering in those specific ways most of the time. Whatever it causes, as each person subjected to this type of vampiric feeding is different, it's never a good thing. And I truly hope that by bringing this to you all now, it will help you not only to understand that it is really happening, but how it happens, and also, maybe, how to at least stand a fighting chance at preventing it. We all should know by now that this world is not everything it appears to be. We all wake in the morning and go about our daily lives, and no matter what that may look like for you, the one constant, whether you're aware of it or not, is the fact that in the darkness of the places we cannot see, and I don't mean that there's no light and it's dark, although I'm sure it's happening then too, but in broad daylight and all over the world, there is something terribly dark and sinister taking place that most people, even sensitives and those with certain abilities, just aren't aware of. Sure, as I already stated earlier, most people can sense there's something happening and that it's negative, but only some of us can actually see it. More and more people are waking up every single day and realizing they have certain abilities in them that they never noticed before. So with more and more people waking up, recognizing and possibly even learning how to use their own abilities for the greater good of the collective, there is still a very large fraction of humanity that haven't the slightest clue and know nothing of even the concept that we are all literally food. No idea about the things that come in and out of our dimensions that most of us can't even see and some of us can't even sense, who energetically take from us. This has all been going on since the dawn of time, and we are just now, as a collective, coming to even have an inkling of it. It's that powerful. Whether or not being more aware is going to do any good and make any real sort of difference is solely based on how much of this, if any, you're willing to believe. It's not a joke, and it's not going away. In fact, it all seems to be getting worse and happening so much more nowadays than ever before. Maybe by the end of this, we will have some kind of answer to or reasoning for that. It used to be that almost exclusively people with abilities were subject to these types of things, but that's not the case anymore. There is an absolutely ghastly number of paranormal and otherworldly entities, energies, and creatures that torture us physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and psychically, and also that utterly terrify us. It's nothing new, and they've been doing it for millennia. They are parasitic in nature, and it is definitely not a symbiotic relationship that I'm talking about here. These things are monstrous. They're leeches who not only feed on us, but suck us almost dry in all of the above-mentioned ways. These creatures feed on our sexual energy, our often very high states of emotion, and even our very life force. They roam around, most of them in the form of energy, and just lurk and wait for the right moment, usually while we are operating at our lowest frequency, but sometimes at our highest too, think sexual here, and then they pounce on us and begin to feed almost until we are completely drained. Almost. This is definitely not a good situation, as these things individually and separately hate and despise us, but yet they need us in order to survive. And this is, at least according to popular opinion on the subject, the reason why they don't just kill us off and take the planet for themselves. I'm positive they wish to do just that, but can't, because without us, they would starve to death. There is extensive data which proves that the soul, or the human life force, however you want to put it, and whatever name you give it, it doesn't really matter because it's all the same thing, is something that every single one of these entities undoubtedly needs to survive. Our soul, our essence, our energy, our very being. Even scarier is they are so multifaceted that between them they can take on almost any shape, size, and image that they choose at any given time. Have you ever had one of those nightmares that was so incredibly intense you wake up not only scared out of your damn mind, but also in a state of panic and with some sort of deep sense that perhaps it wasn't a nightmare at all, but that it actually happened? Even when it's something you wake up like this to but can't even remember what it is? That's because most of the time, in this scenario at least, it did happen. Just it happened when you were sleeping and at your most vulnerable. You're mentally, emotionally, physically, psychically, and even spiritually drained. You're exhausted and feel as though you haven't slept in days despite having just woken up, even from a solid 8 to 10 hours. Your entire day is off because you're unusually lethargic, and perhaps you don't even feel like doing anything you have to do that day at all. It sounds all too familiar, doesn't it? Are you finding this happening more and more lately, in more recent years? Let me set a scene for you here for you to imagine. You're up and panicked, terrified and confused, and know somewhere deep down that what just happened in your worst nightmare really happened, somehow. Do you chalk it up to your being paranoid or foolish? Then please understand that that's exactly what these things bet on. They think we are stupid and simply food for them and nothing else, and they can almost guarantee that most of us won't even give it a second thought once we are out of bed and on with our day. Most of us are over it by the time we are consuming our morning coffee or green tea blends. I know it sounds odd, but even dreams aren't always dreams. With the dark must come the light, and with the good must come the bad, right? I wonder why it's so easy for us to believe a dream, perhaps about a deceased loved one coming to give us a message, that could have been a real message and a real visitation, but we draw a hard line at believing the same thing for our nightmares. This is, of course, where the shadow people and sleep paralysis come into play. Those incessantly annoying and very creepy entities who usually manifest between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m., essentially when it's dark outside. I'm sure whether you've ever personally encountered them or not, every single one of you just got an image of one type of shadow entity or another in your head, which you saw or heard about somewhere you can't quite place. Yes, you can see them during the day as well, and a lot of people, again, more so in recent years, do see them in the day and night and inside as well as outside. For the most part and throughout history, though, the darkest hours for us is their most chosen time to appear and do their damage, or depending on the type, do whatever it is that they do. These things, at least the hostile ones, which I call the sleep paralysis demons, literally paralyze us and vampirically feed off of our energy and essence. Our terror. They feed off of our fear and our life force, just as the vampires, like the ones in the Anne Rice novels, hold people down and feed off of their blood. There's been cases where the elusive and mythical vampire of ancient legend and lore has obtained for themselves what they call donors. Donors are humans who are said to voluntarily give their blood to the vampire so they can feed, and it's almost unheard of for the creature to drain the donor. What good would that do? That's exactly what I like in the shadow people and the so-called sleep paralysis they put us into, too. Who knows? And some would say it's a fact. While I am mainly just considering it, it makes sense that perhaps the blood-sucking vampires we know and have grown to love thanks to modern-day fiction got their start in this world thanks to the nameless, hardly seen, and therefore unknown shadows that feed off of our energy in the night. Is it possible that someone knew exactly what was going on and just decided to put a face to it and change a few of the minor details? If you want to know or are expecting to learn here exactly what the shadow people or shadow entities are, then you're out of luck. The topic simply of what they are is subject to a lot of drama and so much debate. Everyone has their opinions as to what these multidimensional beings are and what they want, where they come from, and how long they've been here. Every single thing about them is technically unknown. Even those of us who may think we know really can't back it up with facts and tangible evidence. There is data, but even that varies depending on who you speak to and depending on who collected it. Do they come from the fourth dimension? Are they like us without light and therefore seek us out to restore their own light? Is our light a part of the essence they seem so desperate to steal from us in the middle of the night while we're asleep and at our most vulnerable? All really great, reasonable questions, all without final answers. There are a few people who are considered to be a bit more knowledgeable than the rest of us, though, those who have written a book or two, but again, it's all just based on either secondhand accounts, speculation, and or personal experiences. Regardless of any of this and what you believe, the bottom line is that for many entities, energies, and even some extraterrestrials, we are their food. The question I am most asked by clients and even random people who approach me is there anything we can do about any of this? The answer to that is a resounding yes. That's exactly what I want to delve into in this book. Come and take a walk with me through the terrifying unknown and get to know the creatures that so often make us their prey and we don't even know it. The only time we recognize them is when they appear cloaked in the darkness of night in the middle of what we are calling sleep paralysis episodes. It's not all that simple, though. It's really not. Chapter 5, Christopher Case. Christopher Case was an elevator music executive in the 1990s. In 1999, he lived in Seattle, Washington, in the 1300 block of North 152nd Avenue in North King County. He was described as a fitness buff, happy-go-lucky, and easygoing with tons of friends. Chris was extremely physically fit and took great care in his appearance. Despite his personality, good looks, and great career, he was single at the time and preferred staying home by himself and just listening to ancient Egyptian music, which was somewhat of an obsession for him. He really wasn't looking for love or even to date anyone at this point in his life. Chris traveled a lot for work, and while on a business trip to California on April 11, 1999, he decided to go out to San Francisco with his friends who were there with him because they were also his co-workers. One of his co-workers decided to bring along a lady friend of his who was local to the area. This woman, by all accounts, was extremely attractive, and she was described as intense looking. She was about 20 years older than Chris, who was at that time 35 years old. The four of them talked all night, and by all accounts, they had a nice evening. The unnamed woman and Chris found they had a lot of similar interests, including, oddly enough, ancient Egyptian music. Chris was only looking at this woman platonically, however, and at the end of the night, she asked if he wanted to go back to her place. Chris realized the woman was interested in him romantically, and he declined her offer, as not only was he not interested, but he didn't want to lead her on because he really did enjoy her company. She asked him again and somewhat pleaded that they could just sit and talk more and listen to music. According to Chris, when he later recounted the story to his friends, after the second decline of her offer, she started to get super pushy and aggressive. She kept insisting he come back to her place and spend the night, which made him very uncomfortable. He was trying to be polite to her, decline her offer in a nice way, and not come off as rude, but the woman just kept pushing and insisting and would not stop. She wouldn't take his no for an answer. Finally, Chris decided he needed to just make his exit. He told her and everyone else that he was just going to go back to his hotel and cheerfully said goodnight to everyone. As he stood up to leave, this beautiful, charming, and friendly woman suddenly became visibly angry. She pulled Chris in close as he went to shake her hand and whispered in his ear, quote, "I'm a witch, and I'm going to put a curse on you, and you're going to die by the end of this week." End quote. Although taken aback, Chris turned and left without another word. The next day, April 12, 1999, he and his co-workers flew back home to Seattle. Once Chris was home, he called a good friend of his named Sammy. Sammy was an old friend who was not only a teacher, but also a psychic. Understand that Chris was, by all accounts, not superstitious or religious by any means. He called Sammy and recounted this bizarre encounter with this crazy lady that he had had the night before. Although he didn't even remotely believe in such things as curses, witches, and spells, he did think it was extremely weird and just wanted to talk about it with a friend. Neither Chris nor Sammy took any of this very seriously and chalked it up to a random encounter where maybe the woman just had too much to drink and or was sensitive to being rejected. About 48 hours after the encounter on April 13th, 1999, Chris later told his friends he kept hearing whispering coming from outside of his bedroom near his front door. Keep in mind he lived alone and didn't have any pets. Also, from the time he got home until now, everything had been perfectly normal and routine for him. He explained that he had heard this whispering that was starting and stopping, but not being superstitious at all. He just chalked it up to him being tired and possibly hearing things. Once all the lights in his apartment were turned off and Chris had lain down in his bed to try and get some sleep, he heard the whispering again, but this time he heard it coming from all the way across his apartment. No longer from near the front door, but on the other side of the place altogether. He then started thinking that maybe someone broke into his house and what he was hearing was a burglar. With this thought, Chris got up out of bed and followed the sound of the whispering into his laundry room, but once he reached the laundry room and flipped on the light, it stopped completely. Suddenly, all was back to being silent again in the house. He didn't see or hear anything further at this point, so, laughing at himself for getting all worked up over what now seemed to be nothing, he turned to go back to his bedroom to just go back to sleep. This is when, out of the corner of his eye and in his peripheral vision, he saw a dark shadow run across the room by his front door/kitchen area. This was where he had first heard the whispering coming from. At this point, Chris was really thinking that he was in fact being burgled and started turning on all of the lights in the house. This is also when he started hearing the whispering yet again, only this time it was coming from literally all over the whole apartment. He walked through all of the rooms and turned on all of the lights because now he was looking for a person. He was looking for an actual human intruder, a burglar. The whispering at this point was a bit secondary because he thought that the shadow figure he had just seen run past his kitchen out of the corner of his eye was a person, a human being who had broken into his home to rob him while he slept. Or worse. Standing in one place with all of the lights on, Chris could see the entire layout of the place and realized there was nobody there. The entire apartment was empty except for himself. This was when it occurred to him that he could still hear the whispering. It sounded now as though it were coming from his bedroom, but once he got there, he couldn't pin down where exactly it was coming from. And so it would go that if he thought he heard it coming from the bedroom, once he got in there to check, it would seemingly move and start sounding like it was coming from somewhere else in the apartment or stop altogether. Needless to say, Chris didn't get any sleep that night because the whispers never stopped all night, and he spent the entirety of it chasing them down, only for them to either stop or disappear the minute he reached the spot or room where he thought they had been coming from. Also, as he was chasing phantom whispers throughout his place, he was still seeing the shadowy figures out of his peripheral vision. However, anytime he would try to look them dead on or turn toward where he had just seen them out of the corner of his eye, there would be nothing and no one there again. The next morning, on April 14th, Chris decided to call Sammy. All of this information came from Sammy recounting to the police later on all of the conversations she had had with Chris throughout that week. When he called Sammy, he was completely panicked, like she had never heard him before, as he recounted to her what had happened to him the night before. She later said that she was worried right from the beginning, from the first phone call, because it was just so incredibly unlike Chris to be freaking out about things like whispers and shadow people. It was extremely worrying for him to even be considering anything supernatural or paranormal, because he definitely did not believe in any of it. She actually described him as terrified. He was a real stand-up guy and always so level-headed, so he felt like he couldn't call the police because what would he tell them? I'm hearing random phantom whispers and seeing shadow people out of my peripheral vision. He knew how insane that sounded. Sammy tried to reassure him and just hoped for whatever happened not to happen again. She was very concerned at that point, but eventually they got off the phone. Remember, this is the late 90s, so there were only landline telephones when all of this was happening. So that night, the night of the 14th, the same thing happened again in Chris's apartment. As soon as he turned off all the lights and tried to go to sleep, the whispering and noises would start up, and he had to get up and turn on all of the lights and start hunting down where the sounds were coming from, but it seemed as though every time he got close to it, it disappeared or moved to somewhere across the house. Now, keep in mind, he was sleep deprived because he hadn't slept the entire night before, having been up doing the exact same thing, dealing with the whispers and shadow people running through his apartment. The difference this night, though, was that Christopher was actually able to see the shadows running around and saw that they were actually in the silhouette of people. Now, because everything was becoming more and more vivid as the night progressed, Christopher wasn't sure if that was actually a case of reality, that shadow people were really running him all around his apartment, whispering to him all night long, or if it was the lack of sleep from the previous night which was making him have even more realistic delusions and hallucinations. He spent his second night chasing these things throughout his apartment and once again didn't get a wink of sleep. The next day, on April 15th, Christopher decided to call a few of his other friends, who chose to this day to remain anonymous. According to what they reported later on, all of them had gotten the exact same account from Chris as Sammy that she had gotten the first night it had happened. They all said that basically no matter what was actually happening, and no matter if they or anyone else believed it was happening, that Chris definitely believed it was happening, and he started spiraling very quickly after all of this started. They concluded that whatever it was he either thought or was actually experiencing, it was really terrifying him. On the night of the 15th, Chris decided and was determined to finally get some sleep. He tried his best to convince himself that the events of the 2 previous nights were as a result of stress and lack of sleep. He was basically trying to convince himself that it was safe for him to go to sleep, as he had been awake for more than 48 hours at that point and was admittedly on the verge of delirium anyway. Unfortunately, things were about to get much worse for poor Christopher Case. Eventually, he was able to fall asleep, but he woke up in the middle of the night hearing whispers again. This time, though, he was completely and totally paralyzed. He couldn't move at all and knew right away that this wasn't sleep paralysis because, although he was totally immobile, he was also wide awake. Now, remember, it was pitch black at this moment because Chris slept without a single light on in his whole apartment. The whispering started to move from outside of his bedroom door to his closet and then to directly under his bed. He started praying that this was just a nightmare and that nothing bad was going to happen, because now he was thinking of and worrying about these shadow beings that had been in his house in the past couple of nights. All of a sudden, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something coming up from under the bed next to him. At this point, he could only move his eyes. So he did. He moved his eyes only, and when he looked over, he saw one of the shadow figures appear right next to his bed. He couldn't see any features or anything, but he definitely, from what he could glimpse at least, could see that it was one of the shadow/human-shaped things he'd been seeing, and it was right there next to his bed. This shadow entity was just hovering over Chris's paralyzed body. All of a sudden, while he sat there helpless and unable to move a muscle, the shadow thing reached down, grabbed a hold of Chris's neck, and began to choke him. He was completely immobilized and therefore couldn't fight back or even struggle against the attack. The entity then started lifting him by his neck and off of his bed. He had no concept of time and therefore never really knew how long it held him there for, but eventually, after a few minutes or possibly even just a few seconds, it threw him back down and vanished into thin air. By this point, not only was Chris gasping for air and struggling to breathe, but he also still could not move. He just lay there, totally convinced that this thing was going to come back and kill him. He wholeheartedly believed that he was going to die that night, and he was absolutely terrified. Eventually, Chris somehow managed to fall asleep while still unable to move and terrified the thing was going to come back and kill him in his bed that night. When he woke up, he could move again, but when he did so, he saw some kind of incisions on his fingers. 10 in total, 1 for each finger. The tips of each finger had been cut off. His hands in bed were full of blood, which we can safely assume was Chris's own from those horrible cuts he had apparently sustained while asleep that night. He immediately got up to look in the mirror because his neck was hurting him. Sure enough, there were marks and bruises going around his entire neck, and it also looked as though someone had strangled him, just as the shadow person had done the night before while he was incapacitated. This brings us to April 16th, and Chris just woke up to these incisions and these marks on his neck, so the night before suddenly hit him all at once. He realized that everything that happened had actually happened. It wasn't sleep paralysis, it wasn't a nightmare, it was now his own reality. He was terrified and feared for his life. He decided to call Sammy, and he told her what happened. She said she was absolutely speechless. She later said he was so terrified and panicked that he could barely articulate what had happened, and that if she didn't know Chris and his character, she wouldn't have believed any of it. And that's really saying something because remember, Sammy is a psychic. She tried to calm him down and get him to call the police, but Chris knew that he would sound like an absolute crazy person, wondering what he would even tell the police if he did call them. Again, would he say a shadow person who definitely wasn't human appeared out of nowhere in my room last night, tried to strangle me to death and cut up my fingers. Oh, and by the way, I've also been hearing random phantom whispering throughout the last couple of nights that I can't place where it's coming from. Chris decided that wasn't going to get him very far with the police, even if he did call them, which he decided he wasn't going to. So, finally, it dawned on him. Maybe the woman in San Francisco did put a curse on him, and he decided that he wasn't going to take it lying down. He started to do some research. Chris was known as being a very reasonable and rational man, so in doing all of this of his own research by himself, he thought he could avoid too many people knowing what was going on with him. He was very high up in his company and feared gaining some kind of troublesome or even crazy reputation for himself. He went to a local bookstore and obtained some books about demonic possessions, the occult, witchcraft, etc. He not only purchased a bunch of books, but he bought anywhere from 10 to 15 crucifixes. After doing some research in his apartment, he ended up putting those crucifixes all over and in every room. He also poured salt along the baseboard in each room. He made one long line that wasn't broken, but that just went in, around, and against every wall. Chris then took the salt and poured a little pile of it in every corner of the apartment. In his utter desperation, he was doing everything he had read and heard that he should do in the case of demonic possessions, entities attacking, witchcraft, and spells. He just wanted to protect himself, at least until he could figure out not only what was going on, but how to get rid of and or stop whatever it was. The very next night, April 16th, Chris had just got done putting all of these protective measures into place, and honestly, nobody knows what actually happened to him that night. What we do know is that in the middle of the night, he went running out of his apartment in nothing but boxers and checked himself into a hotel. The next morning, April 17th, Sammy called Chris to check on him, and in 1999, remember, the only option was a landline call, and he didn't answer her because he was at the hotel. However, neither Sammy nor anyone else knew that because he had left in the middle of the night and didn't have time to tell anyone. Now, keep in mind, Sammy had been speaking to Chris these past few days, and he'd been telling her and describing to her everything that had been going on, so when he didn't answer, she completely panicked and called the police and asked them to do a welfare check at Chris's apartment. His other anonymous friends were also concerned and agreed a welfare check would be the best thing. The police went to his apartment, but all was quiet and the place was locked up, so they told Sammy that nothing really seemed out of the ordinary and that the place was locked up tight. They also explained that they couldn't break down the door or otherwise gain entry just for a welfare check, particularly when all seemed well. Sammy lived all the way across the country and was completely panicked but helpless to do anything. Sammy went to work that day, and when she got home, she had a voicemail from Chris from earlier in the day when she was at work. Chris told her in what she later described as a kind of defeated voice, which the past few days he sounded nothing but terrified, that he was under attack and felt he was going to die that night. He also told Sammy in the voicemail that neither he nor anyone else could do anything about it. He sounded as though he were just accepting it, as though he recognized it as absolute. To him, or so it seemed, it was simply fate or fact. Sammy tried to call Chris back, but again, he was at the hotel, and though she was extremely concerned for and worried about her friend, she knew if she called the police back, they were most likely not going to go back to his apartment at all, or at least they wouldn't go back until the next day. Sammy then decided she would just let it go until the morning. This brings us to the morning of April 18th, 7 days after he met the woman who claimed she was a witch and put a curse on him. Word got back to Sammy that morning that Chris had not shown up for work, and no one can get in touch with him or had heard from him all day. She decided to call the police back and explain the situation, this time including the facts that he had uncharacteristically missed work that day and that no one had seen or heard from him, aside from the voicemail she received the day before, in days. The police went back to Chris's apartment and saw that his front door was wide open. They walked inside to check everything out and make sure Chris was okay. The police later stated they weren't sure what to think when they walked into Chris's apartment and saw all the piles and lines of salt, as well as many of the crucifixes that were recently hung up all over the walls. Chris had not gotten rid of any of those things because he was using them to try and protect himself from whatever was attacking him in the past week. Police also found dozens of candles completely burned out and all these little messages scattered all over his house, which were later determined to be written in Chris's handwriting. They were allegedly notes that supposedly were to ward off demons, witches, curses, etc. After seeing all of these seemingly random and bizarre things in his apartment, they decided to just finish searching and move on. The last room they checked was the bathroom, and this is where they found Christopher Case's dead body. When they found him, Chris was fully clothed in a waterless bathtub surrounded by dozens of burnt out candles and more crucifixes. Also odd was Chris's position, as he was found on his knees with his hands in prayer position and pushed up against his chest. There were no obvious external injuries, and the coroner ended up concluding that Chris had died of natural causes, mainly a heart attack. Needless to say, his friends and family were not buying into this, and they tried desperately to explain to the police and the coroner what Chris had been going through in the past week, and everything that he was telling them had been happening to him beginning 7 days earlier when he met the woman who claimed to have been a witch and allegedly cursed him. No information ever came to light about the woman who had seemingly put this hex on Chris, and no new information has ever been learned about this case. It is still considered a death by natural causes. I included this case in this book specifically because it's the only case I have ever come across so far where I fully believe, as do many other people, that Chris was in fact killed by shadow people. Whether through the means of a curse or not, and regardless of what the entity actually was. It could have been literally anything at all, but chose to present itself to him in shadow during all of the harassment and throughout each individual attack. This case has many facts and records which are available to the public. It was featured on the old show Unsolved Mysteries with Robert Stack. There's no denying what happened here, and it's one of the most terrifying cases I have ever come across because it took a young man's life. Chapter 6, The Hat Man. The Hat Man is definitely something most of us have at least heard of, right? It's actually fast becoming the most commonly reported type of shadow entity cited in the last 20 years or so. Reports of the Hat Man are indiscriminate in where they come from. If you've never experienced this entity, then let me describe it for you. Imagine, if you will, a humanoid bipedal silhouette of a man, which looks almost comically as though he walked right out of an earlier decade and forgot to change his clothes. The era of the 40s and 50s seemed to be its heyday, so keep that in mind as well as we move forward. That's the general gist of the Hat Man. The comic relief doesn't last long, though, as the terror and fear strike you to your very bones almost instantly upon laying eyes on the infernal being. The fact that this entity is all black yet dense, a complete and total shadow, lends to not only its mystery, but to the terror and dread it strikes into the hearts of those who witness it. Another highly esteemed expert on the shadow entity phenomenon, who I mentioned earlier and who I believe is just absolutely brilliant, is Heidi Hollis. She wrote a book in 2014 based almost solely on this particular form of shadow entity, and it's titled The Hat Man, The True Story of Evil Encounters. She's collected more witness statements and encounters with this creature than I have, and that's really saying something. Let's talk very briefly about one of the encounters in her book. It's enough to give you the general idea of what it is we're dealing with here. Quote, Dear Heidi, I was maybe 5 years old when the Hat Man started to visit me. Every night I would lay in the top bunk of my bed and watch as my door would crack open for him to creep inside. As high up as I would still have to look up to see him, and I would freeze in horror at the sight of him, end quote. That pretty much sums it up, as anyone who has ever had the extreme displeasure of having an encounter with this entity will tell you. It's quite horrific and frightening, to say the least. While the Hat Man may seem to most people like just another shadow entity, there are some things that stand out about him/it that make me think he may be a separate entity all his own, or possibly a leader of some sort with some form of dominion over the other, lesser shadow beings. Most of the other shadow entities, even when focused on, are quite vague. This is why I'm going through the different types with you here in this book. What sets them apart is how they behave. Even when you're able to focus on them really well, they have the same basic features. Not Mr. Hat Man, though. He is not only consistently described as wearing some sort of hat, with cowboy hat, fedora, or even top hat being the main three, but of wearing distinguishable clothing as well. Many times he will be described as wearing a three-piece suit or a trench coat. I have even come across encounters where the witness swore they saw a pocket watch included in the ensemble, which he will glance at or even pull out of his pocket from time to time. The imagery itself evokes a deeply ingrained sense of terror inside of me that absolutely chills me to my core. We've already discussed the benign shadow people, and later we will even explore the rare occurrence of the shadow entities who are flat out helpful. Again, it's hard to know what you're dealing with until they make their move. The Hat Man always brings with him a sense of fear, terror, and or doom. There has never been a case where a Hat Man has come and brought feelings of calm and serenity, wanting to make friends or be helpful. He is definitely evil all of the time. The opinion is almost split down the middle as to whether or not there is a single Hat Man who terrorizes the entire world with his presence, or if there are many entities who fall under this category and who simply all look exactly the same. I am of the opinion that there are many of them. If they weren't, for whatever reason, always only seen by our human eyes in shadow, I wonder if they would all look completely different. After all, if you found another long-haired woman who stood at 5'7" tall and had a total mom bod, put her next to me and then turned off the lights, if you didn't know either one of us, would you really be able to tell the difference between us? Add to that the sense of fear and confusion that overtakes the witnesses by simply laying their eyes on it, and then tell me if you would be able to tell the difference. The answer, most likely, would be a resounding no. There are many people who believe as well that the Hat Man will almost exclusively visit people who are experiencing some type of lower vibrational or negative emotion to the extreme. For example, not only anger or sadness, but downright rage or grief. While this is definitely a common thread in the Hat Man victims, whether they're aware of it or not, I do not think they are exclusively visiting people who are experiencing such major and acute emotions. I believe they are indiscriminate and that all shadow entities are here to feed off of all emotions, positive and negative. It stands to reason that the more extreme the emotion, the better the energy tastes or is absorbed by it. While this is certainly a common thread, it's common to all shadow entity encounters. Most people aren't that aware of their deep inner emotions or feelings before the fear and dread these encounters and attacks bring about to be able to get any sort of conclusive data on this. Earlier, I touched on the possibility of telepathic communication between shadow entities and their victims, and here is another way in which this entity specifically stands out. The Hat Man is known to be quite vocal in his threats of harm and words of terror. He has no qualms about screaming in a witness's face or whispering in their ears. On the rare occasion someone does report a different type of shadow entity verbally speaking to them, it's always in some language that to our human ears sounds like absolute gibberish. Again, though, the Hat Man is unique, and he very clearly and plainly says what he intends to say without hesitation. I've noticed as well that whatever language the witness speaks, that's the language the Hat Man will speak to them. The Hat Man also has a very different way of moving than his seemingly lower counterparts. While the other shadow entities are always reported as gliding or otherwise floating through the air, and even while seeming to be standing still are just hovering, the Hat Man walks like a human being and actually stands on the floor. This sounds reasonable, as he is sometimes not only seen with the aforementioned pocket watch, but also tipping his hat to the victim as well. Here is an example of an encounter with the Hat Man, which has all of the standard identifiable characteristics and more. It starts with a woman we might call Megan, who says she started being visited by the entity in 1978 when she was only 6 years old. Megan grew up in Alabama and spent a significant amount of time that year and 1979 at her grandparents' house, who lived in the same state. She, her mother, and her sister lived with her grandparents on and off due to her grandfather being in and out of the hospital so much and the family not wanting the elderly woman to be left alone in the home while he was gone. Megan and her sister shared the only spare bedroom in the house, and when other relatives would come to visit, which happened often, the two would have to give up that room and stay in their grandmother's room with her. It didn't take too many nights of this for both of the young girls to understand that they weren't alone and that something evil was lurking around. Megan would sleep between her grandmother and her little sister with her head at the foot of the bed. She recalls having a very vivid recurring nightmare where, as she lay in the exact same spot she was sleeping in, she would awaken to the dresser drawers in the room flying open by themselves, with clothing and ghosts flying out of each one. This struck me immediately as uncommon because normally we dream of being anywhere other than exactly where we are lying while having the dream. Megan's dream self tried to gently kick around in order to rouse either her sister or her grandmother, but neither would wake up. She states that in her dream she debated whether or not to walk into the other room and wake up her mother, but decided against it for being fearful of having to walk past the dresser, which was directly next to the only door leading out of the room. Dream Megan looked away from the dresser and over to the window, and that's when she saw the Hat Man for the very first time. Of course, she wasn't aware at the time of what she was seeing. The window was directly behind the headboard of the bed, and all she knew at that moment was that a very tall man wearing a hat was lurking there. At first, she thought the strange man was standing on top of the headboard, but as she got older and thought about it more, she realized that most likely he was just extremely tall, seemingly even more so considering she was only a 6-year-old little girl. This man was wearing a top hat, a long flowing coat, and was carrying a cane. She also explained that he had no real features, and that, even though he seemed to be made of shadow, he still somehow managed to block out all of the light that was coming in from the window, from the moon, and other lights outside. Not only was she terrified because there was someone else in the room with her who definitely should not have been there, but also because she immediately recognized him as non-human. The two locked eyes, or so it seemed, with her only knowing where eyes should have been, but seeing none, for what seemed like forever, but was most likely just a few seconds, and then the figure lifted his arm and pointed right at her. It said, "This is your last chance." Megan describes this interaction very well, and it's something that I have come across many times, but with people being unable to fully get across what she's about to say despite their best efforts. She would say later that the voice didn't fill the room at all, but rather was inside of her head. Quote, "The voice was flat, with no residual sound, as if everything surrounding the words had been removed," end quote. That was it. Just 5 little words, and then the entity put its arm down and vanished back into the darkness. The next day, when Megan told her family about the strange dream, they chalked it up to a terrible nightmare and didn't give it any more thought. Megan said that she kind of remembers being a little bit nervous when she had to sleep in her grandmother's room after that, but only for a short time, and then she somehow forgot about it. Megan explained that her whole family believed in the paranormal and were often swapping stories, trying to scare one another or just creep someone else out. She didn't give the Hat Man or that encounter another thought until she was a teenager. One night she was sitting around with her family and they were all excitedly sharing their own paranormal encounter stories. Her mother, sister, and grandmother were all there with her, along with one of her aunts. Megan said that all of her family were spooked and fascinated by her encounter of that dream so long ago. However, her aunt didn't have the same reaction as the others and seemed to be almost terrified as she turned a ghostly shade of pale herself and told of an encounter she had had in that same house with that same man. The family was shocked, and they were all reluctant to spend any time in Grandma's room after that. It brought Megan back to wondering, though, as now that she is an adult, she realizes she wasn't dreaming at all and had had a real paranormal encounter with the Hat Man entity. What did it mean that night by what it said? She says the only explanation she could think of is that her grandfather had been in the hospital at that time and that he had died shortly after her encounter without her ever having seen him again. She feels that maybe the entity was telling her it was her last chance to spend some time with Grandpa before he passed. I don't believe that at all, but I will let you all come to your own decisions on it. Could he have been a friendly Hat Man who couldn't help how he appeared to this little girl? Doubtful, as if that were the case and he could clearly speak English, then why not just come right out and say that she needed to go and see her grandpa because he was going to die? We'll never know the real answers to this or so many other questions regarding this entity in particular or shadow people in general, but we could make our own guesses. Chapter 7, Sleep Paralysis. A psychology professor at Northwest Missouri State University named April Haberan claims that most encounters with shadow entities are probably the product of dreams or nightmares. She explains that when people are sleeping and entering the REM phase, quote, it's common for them to see things, end quote. Essentially, she believes that everything involved in sleep paralysis, at least regarding the feeling of dread and even being attacked by shadow people or other entities, is all completely normal. Quote, there are hormones in REM sleep that paralyze the major muscle groups, and it's called paradoxical sleep. Although this happens during REM, these people don't stay asleep and the hormones are still in their bodies. It can last up to 8 minutes and they feel pressure on their chest and can see people, end quote. This is insinuating that the entity will be gone when the person wakes up. Don't get me wrong, that does happen, the person waking and the entity being gone in some cases, but there are more reports than I could name where the person was fully awake and not in either REM state or between sleeping and waking, where the entity, whatever terrifying thing it was in that instance, is still there and still very much attacking or otherwise terrorizing them. What about the encounters that happen in broad daylight while the person isn't or wasn't even sleeping at all or trying to sleep? It's these encounters which make me push aside all scientific explanations altogether. It's been said that approximately 7% of the world's population will experience what science calls a sleep paralysis episode at some point in their lives. The encounters that come to me personally and that are all over the internet definitely make up a lot more than that percentage, and by far. It's true that during the REM phase of sleep, we can experience dreamlike images and perceptions, and that while half asleep, we can trick ourselves into believing that an inanimate object we see every day in our bedrooms, for example, a coat rack, is some sort of entity there that's causing the paralysis we feel. Sleep paralysis is a real thing, don't get me wrong, but I just can't justify it being responsible for every single encounter I've come across where someone was attacked or terrorized by something in their environment that wasn't human, and that definitely didn't belong there. Scientists and experts on the subject say that the entities that are either seen or perceived are a result of subconscious dream activity and the body's inability to properly cycle through all of the sleep stages and therefore perceive, with any combination of the 5 senses, some entity like a demon or shadow person who they believe is there to induce harm. Okay, but if it isn't real, then why is it that what we are allegedly only perceiving is always there, in our minds at least, to hurt us? What about the people who have physical injuries and symptoms of attacks? Our mind certainly cannot manifest the bruises, burns, bite marks, scratches, and so much more that a lot of people wake up with after one of those experiences. While it's true that women are more likely to have an encounter episode, it obviously happens to men as well. Here's one of the many accounts I have come across that science blames fully on sleep paralysis and tricks of the mind. A 35-year-old man named Mike, who was married, had been struggling with alcohol addiction for most of his life. He had had some clean time under his belt, but always fell off the wagon and started drinking again. His tolerance was extremely high, so when he decided to stop drinking cold turkey, the withdrawal effects were too much for him to handle. This is why he always gave in and started drinking again, at least according to him. Mike enlisted the help of his wife, and through a referral from his PCP, his primary care provider, he was able to get himself into a rehab. He also had a history of severe panic attacks, which had, in recent years to what was happening, were becoming more frequent and increasingly more overwhelming. Mike told the psychiatrist while in the rehab that the panic attacks mainly started while he was sleeping or trying to fall asleep. The doctor determined that he was having episodes of sleep paralysis. Mike explained there was one specific entity he encountered over and over again during these episodes of alleged sleep paralysis. The entity was a woman who would always appear standing alongside his bed and whom he believed had murderous intent toward him. Mike fully believed that it was this mysterious woman who was somehow immobilizing him and rendering him unable to breathe and who was paralyzing his muscles. Just like most other episodes of sleep paralysis, Mike was fully cognizant of the woman and could see her very clearly, but couldn't move anything but his eyeballs. The woman was allegedly also choking him. As he tried to fight back and get her hands off of his throat, or, as he believed, stop her from killing him, he realized he was rendered completely immobile and unable to do anything but lie there and take it and pray that he didn't die. This obviously put Mike into a state of very real and very severe panic, hence where the panic attacks while sleeping had allegedly come from. According to his doctors at least, Mike claimed these attacks from this woman would last anywhere from 2 to 6 minutes. I just want to insert here that the average duration of most sleep paralysis episodes, including the attacks, lasts no more than 8 to 10 minutes tops. This is where I start having problems with the medical and scientific community and their diagnosis and explanations. Mike was having approximately 2 to 3 episodes per year and had been having them for about 9 years by the time he was admitted to that rehab. Once he started receiving psychiatric help, the events increased to about 2 per week. This made him somewhat paranoid that something bad was going to happen to him while in the care of those professionals, and he started having terrible anxiety, which were accompanied now by heart palpitations and severe insomnia. So basically, at least from my point of view, the alleged professionals here were making things worse and completely dismissing Mike's concerns. Also, they were blaming his addiction. According to one report, Mike was eventually able to overcome his fears, anxieties, and even his addictions, but it's unknown if he's still having these rendezvous with the mysterious, murderous stranger of the night. So-called experts explain that sleep paralysis is characterized by either a sensed presence, perceived fear, or both, which they refer to as intruder hallucinations. The inability to breathe, which inevitably accompanies these sensations or hallucinations, are called, quote, incubus hallucinations, end quote. There are auditory and visual presences, which include but definitely aren't limited to hearing footsteps, sensing an intruder, and seeing shadows. So this all sounds just like the encounters with the shadow entities, and it would all make sense, and the neat little package they're trying to present to us to make believe it's all in our minds, quite literally, would also make sense, except for a few things I'd like to point out. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, way more than 7% of the world has had these experiences. Secondly, none of this accounts for the aforementioned injuries, which are very visible in most cases, cause physical pain, and that there are no other explanations for how they got there. Lastly, there is no actual explanation, as far as I can tell, at least not one that seems reasonable anyway, as to why almost every single person has the exact same types of entities that they quote-unquote perceive. Is it even possible for this many people to be having the exact same hallucinations all over the world and completely independent of one another throughout millennia? I'm not buying it. There's a couple of encounters I've come across in my research that I would love for the scientific community to try and explain away for me. One is the case of a young man who was asleep in his bed, which was right next to the door that led downstairs to the basement. He had just laid down to go to bed and wasn't even asleep yet. He had just closed his eyes when he heard footsteps coming up the basement steps. He turned to look but didn't see anyone, and the basement door was closed as it always was. The noise went away and the boy closed his eyes again. He must have dozed off because when he woke up just a few moments later, he knew because he had his phone in his hand when he fell asleep, he heard not only footsteps coming down the steps, but as he listened closer, he heard breathing in his left ear. He was completely paralyzed except for his eyeballs, which I'm sure at this point were wide and bulging out of his head due to the fear and panic he must have been feeling. He rolled his eyeballs to the side, and sure enough, the basement door was open. There he saw a tiny little white-haired troll with a ghoulish face. The creature was grinning an unnaturally wide grin and staring at him, unblinking, and breathing heavily into his ear. Suddenly, all of the phones in the house started ringing, and it seemed as though the ringing got louder and louder as time went on. He was under the impression he would have permanent tinnitus and started panicking even more. You might be thinking this was a strange thing for him to be worried about at this moment, and we'll get to that in just a minute. After several minutes of looking at this thing, looking and grinning at him, and listening to the symphony of cell phones and landlines build, he was finally able to wiggle his fingers. As he did this, the ringing stopped, but the troll was still there. He managed to lift his arm and blink, and when he reopened his eyes, the basement door was closed and everything was back to normal. This encounter stuck out to me because the entity was more than a mere shadow and very visible, but that's not why I included it here. I brought this specific case to your attention because of the thought process that this man was having during this entire thing. I believe these entities, whether shadow, demon, troll, etc., are there to feed off of us and purposefully put these fears into our heads. Since this troll creature realized possibly that it wasn't provoking enough fear in and of itself, it amped it up a bit and made the guy panic that he would have permanent damage to his body once he was able to move again. I just don't see the scientists convincingly explaining all of this away. I'm not saying I believe sleep paralysis doesn't exist, or even that it's never responsible for hallucinations. But to me, it's just not reasonable that it is the explanation for every single encounter ever had throughout time in the world over. There's just no way. In some countries, they refer to a sleep paralysis episode by saying, quote, "the dead man got me," end quote. This explains it all in a nutshell, really. This is exactly how most people claim to feel when they're in the middle of an episode/attack. The first known scientific description of what we have come to call sleep paralysis dates back to the year 1674 and to a Dutch doctor named Isbrand van Dijmerbroek. The phenomenon at the time had taken on the name, quote-unquote, incubus, and this word was gathered from the mythology popular in Europe in that day and age and since the beginning of the Middle Ages, which meant a demon who perches atop a woman while she sleeps in order to have sex with her. Now we know that while incubus and succubus entities do visit us in the dead of night and often while we are sleeping. We know that already. We know that these can be a part of, be separate from, or have absolutely nothing to do with a sleep paralysis encounter. Just like we here in the paranormal community feel as though we have come a long way from using incubus as a scientific theory or reasoning on what sleep paralysis actually is, so does science. They now say that it is a neurological misfiring while we sleep, and the main causes of it are, in order, not getting enough sleep, sleeping on your back, being extremely stressed out mentally, not being on a regular sleep schedule, and or having a sleep cycle that is for whatever reason constantly disrupted. An example is someone who works an overnight shift or new parents. While we may not ever know what sleep paralysis actually is and whether or not it's paranormal or supernatural in some way, I am fine here on the fence of whether or not I believe all experiences with it are one thing or another. I believe it is a mix of science and spirit, of energy and misfires, and of light and darkness. Speaking of complete and total darkness and adding in a bit of chaos brings me to thoughts of the jinn. Let's get back to the supernatural now, shall we? And then chapter 8 is called The Jinn. Now, I've read the introduction and 3 chapters of my 3rd book, Shadow Entities, Sleep Paralysis, and Beyond, of which you can find links to the Kindle, paperback, and Audible versions in the description box. If you want autographed copies, email me at GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com, and I'll give you information about that. If you want to schedule a one-on-one with me, if you want a general remote personal intuitive oracle reading, if you have no idea what I'm talking about and want to know about the services I offer, including oracle readings, GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. Be kind to each other, guys. It doesn't cost anything. Be kind to yourselves and never accept anything less than others being kind to you. If nobody told you today, you're beautiful, you're amazing, you got this, and you're worth it. I believe in you. I got your back. Always go in grace. Smile at a stranger, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.